I'm David Levine. I'm chair of Science Writers in New York. Thank you for coming out on this rainy evening, but it's warmer than it's been for a while. Please silence phones. My guest tonight is Maia Szalavitz, who's
David, you were really going to have to
Okay, I'm going to hold it right here. It's a nationally known expert on addiction who is a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times and for numerous other publications, including Time, Wired, Elle, The Nation, and Scientific American. Her most recent book, Undoing Drugs, The Untold Story of Harm Reduction and the Future of Addiction, was the first history of the movement aimed at focusing drug policy on minimizing harms and not highs. So Maia, would you like to make an opening statement?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, is this working?
Yeah.
All right,
Okay.
great. Thank you very much for having me here. And I am, I'll just give you a little anecdote. When I was in my active addiction at Columbia University in the mid-'80s, basically, I somehow managed to meet JFK Jr. Jackie O's apartment is, or former building is 1040. It is right down the street here. And I once ended up in a bathroom selling coke at his party there. Anyway, that just was the memory that came to me when I ended up here. Thankfully I am.
So everyone can meet her in the bathroom.
Sadly, I no longer have any supplies, but I am also very glad not to be in that situation anymore. And I'm also very glad it was not RFK. Who did end up speaking at my rehab at a certain point. So that was weird when I was in rehab in 1988, and he was a DA at that time. He seemed very handsome, and we didn't know who he was really, but then later found out, and I was like, oh my God. So I obviously have a personal history of addiction, which is what brought me to this area. I was a weird, geeky kid growing up who had real difficulty connecting with people and was incredibly oversensitive to things. And when I got to college at Columbia, I sort of fell apart. And I, at this point, had discovered cocaine. It was the 80s. Everybody seemed like this would, if it was now, that would have never been my drug of choice, because I really preferred opioids, which I eventually found, and then ended up really crashing. And so by 1986, I was injecting, and it was the AIDS crisis. At that time, 50% of New York City's injection drug users were already HIV positive, and I was about to share a needle with somebody, and somebody told me that, wait a minute, do you know you're at risk for AIDS? And at that point, I read newspapers a day. I was a really informed person. I watched TV news. I was still, trying to be a engaged citizen, despite my active addiction at that point. But no, I had not known that, and I was horrified. And this woman happened to be visiting from San Francisco, and she taught me to use bleach to clean my needles. And since that time during my active addiction, I became as compulsive about using bleach as I was about using needles, which, given I was injecting coke 30 times a day, was pretty compulsive. That is how I got introduced to harm reduction. I didn't know that it was harm reduction, and when I was writing the book that became Undoing Drugs, I wanted to find this woman who had been visiting from San Francisco and taught me to use bleach to protect myself. And I did end up tracking her down. It was quite a remarkable experience, because I did want to thank her for saving my life. And it turned out that she worked with the consortium of agencies that created the IV drug using superhero called Bleach Man. And San Francisco actually in the 80s had like late night TV commercials with Bleach Man teaching you to clean your needles. And I was just very lucky that she visited New York, because here we didn't really have much. And we eventually ACT UP got involved, and a lot of activism did happen around this. And when I was trying to write this book, it was really difficult to trace, like, how did this idea travel around the States at that time. And it originated in the UK and in the Netherlands. It ended up coming here via some people from Liverpool, and going to a social worker named Edith Springer, who was one of the people who ended up doing bleach distribution in New York. And I eventually met her, and she was really one of the key people to bringing this idea to New York. So anyway, that's a very brief and disconnected history, but I am really glad to be here and to talk to you about addiction.
Okay, thank you. I have a question. How come you couldn't just get new needles?
Okay, this is a good point. So in the late 80s and around that time, a lot of American states had banned the sale of needles without a prescription. And states that had a problem with IV drug use thought, aha, we'll just ban needles. And so what happened was that the states with the highest rates of IV drug use banned needles. Those states soon became the states with the highest prevalence of HIV. And when ACT UP did its, so David Dinkins, there was a small experimental needle exchange that Koch, Mayor Koch had set up, that ridiculously had to operate out of right across the street from the courts downtown. So like 3 people went. But Dinkins vowed to shut this evil enabling thing down, and that was one of the first things he did as mayor. And so ACT UP decided, we're going to get arrested deliberately doing needle exchange to prove that it is a necessity for public health. And I actually got to cover this trial, and it was astonishing, because this data that I just mentioned, okay, like the states that have the worst IV drug use problems ban needles. They also have the worst HIV problems, and their IV drug use problems did not go away following the needle ban. So it was quite clear that public health was not being promoted by this law. And you know, in my day when we were, we would get needles from like Vermont or something because they were available over the counter there. But in New York State, they were banned. And so when ACT UP did this action, and they deliberately got arrested, and the judge looked at this data and said, okay, well, all banning needles does is spread HIV. It doesn't prevent IV drug use. So, okay, it's a necessity for public health. ACT UP is right. You don't have to go to jail. And this paved the way for syringe exchange to be legalized in New York State. It was like quite an amazing thing, because it felt historic being there and like at the trial at the time, and just it was so wild when ACT UP actually won.
Okay. So why don't you give some statistics on what are the latest trends in addiction?
Sure. I first want to add that, so at that time, 50% of the people who inject drugs in New York City, there's about 200,000 statistic that we always use, even then when half of them died of AIDS. But this, at that point, large numbers of people were HIV positive. After we did needle exchange and expanded access to methadone, these days, prevalence of HIV in New York in IV drug users, of whom there are still plenty, is now less than 3%. And there are now places where there are now tiny rural counties that have higher numbers of HIV cases in IV drug users than New York City because they refuse to do syringe exchange. So as for recent trends, obviously we are still experiencing an overdose crisis, which has been related to the fact that, sort of in the 90s and early O's, pharmaceutical marketing led to a massive increase in availability of prescription opioids. There is a lot of misinformation about what actually happened because we tend to believe that what happened is innocent white kids got hooked by doctors. In reality, what happened was 80% of people who misuse prescription opioids for the first time don't have a prescription for them. They're using other people's drugs. They're sitting around in their parents' medicine cabinets or that sort of thing. But so, we found out that this overdose, OxyContin crisis is happening, and so, it was caused by the supply, so let's cut the supply. And so, basically, we cut off millions of people at these pill mills, which are not good to have, but which, if you have a pill mill, you have the real name of every person who attends that pill mill, because you can't get the drug without using your real ID to get the prescription, right? But we just cut them all off, and then we're like, oh wow, there's lots of people in pain who are killing themselves, and oh wow, there's lots of fentanyl on the street. How did that happen? Why did it happen why didn't we cure addiction by just getting rid of that supply? Because that is not how you do it. And addiction, if we actually believe that addiction exists, which I think it does, it is compulsive drug use that continues despite negative consequences. And if you simply cut off the supply, you are not getting at the reason people are using drugs. And overwhelmingly, the reason that people with addiction use drugs is to self-medicate something. It could be that they were traumatized as a child. It could be that they were traumatized as a child and they had a predisposition to mental illness, and that predisposition became an actual condition because of the stress of the trauma, and they self-medicated that. Or they may be self-medicating just sort of the existential angst of there's no jobs, it's not going to get better around here, everything sucks. And if you have a large population of people in emotional pain who don't have any access to meaningful work or relationships, and you increase a supply of drugs, you are going to end up with an addiction epidemic. And that is basically what we did. If you look at when overdose starts rising in the United States, it starts rising in 1980, before OxyContin even gets marketed. What also happens around 1980? Economic inequality starts rising, and it happens in parallel. And it's part of what happens when you leave a lot of people behind. Hopefully I didn't, in terms of drug trends, I should really mention that gambling is massively expanding because we have legalized a lot of different ways to gamble. I think in general, it is good to regulate things rather than have them be underground. But it is, as Mark Kleiman, who is a drug policy expert with whom I often argued, but as he said, and I think this is correct, the worst possible situation is absolute prohibition. The second worst possible situation is commercialization. In between is where good drug policy lies. And it's going to, depending on the addictive nature of the substance or activity that you're talking about, that sweet spot between creating a black market and all those harms and having people have too much access is going to be, you're going to find it somewhere in there.
So yesterday we were talking on the phone about there are lots of different addictions, like there's sex addictions, there's gambling addictions. People say they're addicted to chocolate. So what actually is addiction?
So this is a really important question that we don't ask often enough. Addiction is compulsive drug use or other types of behavior that occurs despite negative consequences. And the despite negative consequences is critical for two reasons. The first reason is that addiction has to cause a problem. If you just love something and you do it a lot and it's making your life better, that's not an addiction. If you love something and you're doing it a lot and you are not available for your kids and you are not showing up to work and you are otherwise not able to fulfill your roles and have a decent life, that's an addiction. So it has to do harm. And the other thing that needs to be distinguished there is that sometimes we think that addiction is like physically needing something to function. And we're like, okay, opiates, alcohol, you get horrible withdrawal, and that's why people can't stop. Well, if that were true, for one, nobody would ever relapse. You would go through withdrawal, you could lock somebody in the closet, and they'd be cured. Because no more withdrawal, they're done. This is not how addiction works, as we all know. Addiction is driven by people finding the substance useful for coping. And if you don't have that going on, dependence isn't necessarily a problem. The reason that this distinction becomes really important is because if you define addiction as dependence, cocaine isn't addictive and Prozac is. And what I mean by that is that you can get some pretty nasty withdrawals, not so much from Prozac, but from some of the other SSRIs. But nobody's out robbing drugstores and saying, oh man, I just can't wait for my next dose of Prozac. But cocaine, you don't puke, you don't shake, you crave the hell out of it, and cocaine withdrawal is not a fun experience, but it's not physical. And we have historically been like, oh, that, Scientific American said in like the early 80s when I was in my cocaine days, oh, it's as addictive as potato chips. Of course, now we know that potato chips are addictive. The thing is that physical dependence is not the key to addiction. You can have dependence without addiction, and you can also have addiction without dependence. And it's important to know this, especially because when we use medications like methadone or buprenorphine, also known as Suboxone, to treat addictions, people will still have physical dependence. What they will not have if they are getting their life back is they will not have compulsive behavior despite negative consequences. They are now taking a substance that is just like Prozac, essentially, for them. And they are able to drive and work and love and do all those things because opioids create, if you take it at the same time every day, the same dose, you get a complete tolerance to the intoxicating effect. So you can drive and do all these things. And people do not understand this because we think that, they're still high, and if you're using other things on top of it, you are still high. But if you are simply taking your drugs as prescribed every day, you now have dependence, but no longer addiction.
Okay.
We'll do questions later.
No.
Okay. There's an article this week in the New Yorker about Ozempic and its use in addiction. I highly recommend it. And I said, Susan said she would like to talk about Ozempic's use in addiction.
So I scooped the New Yorker on this, it has been clear from anecdotal experience and also these massive studies of medical records. Like you can now look at okay, we got 20,000 people's medical records anonymized and look at the people with diabetes who are taking Ozempic and other GLP-like drugs and also have opioid addiction versus the people who have those conditions and are taking something else. And it shows dramatic 40-50% reduction in overdose among the people who are taking the GLP-like drugs. If you talk to people who are taking these medications for obesity or diabetes, they often say, oh yeah, I don't want to drink anymore. And like, I don't, the food noise in my head is not really there anymore. And again, there is a absolutely wide variety of human experience with regard to drugs. And so the drug that makes me feel like, oh, no more food noise, I'm happy, I'm living a good life, it's all good, might be for you, I feel zero pleasure in life and everything sucks. And so it's really important to recognize this individual variation, because otherwise we will go through exactly the same thing we went through with the SSRIs, which is when they first came out, oh my God, you're better than well, everybody should take them, they're fabulous. And then 10 years later, it's like, oh no, they turn you into a serial killer and they destroy your sex life and they're terrible. And then 10 years later, it's a placebo. The reality is all of those, maybe not the serial killer thing, but all of those things are true for different people. If and this will inevitably be the case for the GLPs. There clearly are people, and there are beginning to be clinical trials showing this, that they have, I actually wrote about this one such woman for the Times, because I was talking to some people who were prescribing these drugs for people who are also overweight or have diabetes at Hazelden, the famous addiction treatment center, and they were finding really kind of amazing results with people. And they wanted to see, as we all wanted to know, well, okay, what happens if you give this to a set of people who are not that privileged, who are not, in the fancy schmancy best rehab that we have. And so they started looking at it at this place for homeless people who are often formerly incarcerated. It's a shelter-like place and sort of treatment-ish place. Anyway, in Rhode Island, and I interviewed a couple of women who were at this place, and they were like, okay, I have tried many things. I have been sober for 2 years at various points, but I always, I sort of run into my drug dealer on the street and then I go back. And they took the GLP-1 and they were like, they saw their dealer and they're like, that guy's a loser. And, so I was really quite impressed. Again, an anecdote, and we don't have the clinical data yet, but they are finally, the drug companies have finally agreed to study these for addiction, which they didn't originally want to do, just because it's such a stigmatized category, and because if you have a best-selling drug and you test it in a very sick population, it might start to look like your drug is doing bad things to people simply because of the population. So I do think they're really promising. I think the reason that they're promising is that, at least in many cases, what they seem to do is exactly what you would want in an anti-addiction drug. They stop the craving, but they don't block pleasure. And we know in our brains there are at least two forms of pleasure. There's like liking, which is you like it, you enjoy it, it's good, you're having a pleasant experience that is satisfying. And then there's wanting, which is desire. And this can be pleasurable up to a certain point. Like if you are like happily like, yeah, I'm gonna get it, it's really good, that is like a form of pleasure. Obviously, if it's never satiated, that is going to suck after a while. So if you block that or lower that desire aspect of pleasure, you can reduce craving without interfering much with the sort of satiation kind of pleasures that if you don't like anything and you don't feel like anything's pleasurable in your life, why would you take that drug?
Okay. And I'd like maybe for you to address alcohol addiction, and because that's been the classical one with AA and everything else. And how is that a model for opioids and things like that? And then we'll go to questions.
Okay, cool. So, I mean, it is, I shall just talk about the 12-step programs briefly. And I think that there are absolutely many people who have been enormously helped by 12-step programs. And the idea that people with addiction can come together and support each other in getting better is powerful and very positive. The problem comes when, which we have done, we commercialize this and make it the one true way. And we currently still have a treatment system where 90% of the treatment that you go to get, you're going to be taught that the way to recover is to be completely abstinent from all substances other than caffeine and tobacco, which is kind of interesting, but you have to be totally abstinent from everything else, and you have to stay that way for the rest of your life. Now, of course, it is one day at a time, and you do it with support of other people. But the problem there is that the way the 12 steps are written, first of all, some people have an issue with this spiritual stuff, which, again, if I went to a doctor for depression and they told me I had to get on my knees and pray, I would leave too. But some people don't have a problem with that. It shouldn't be forced on anybody. The other aspect is that in the fourth step, which is the one where you take a searching and fearless moral inventory, you're supposed to, this program was created in the 30s by rich white guys, basically. And a lot of their problems were related to, they were doing nasty things to other people, like cheating on their wife and, not being kind and, just being a jerk. So the fourth step is focused on, what did you do wrong? What was your part in all the bad things that happened to you? This is a really terrible model for trauma survivors. And I have talked to many people where they went to meetings, they were a survivor of rape or even child sexual abuse, and they were told, well, what was your part? What did you do to make that happen? And that is contraindicated for trauma. It is bad, it should never be done. Thankfully, most people's sponsors are much more sensible than that and do not interpret this way. But there are, unfortunately, still people and still rehabs that do this. And my personal experience, my personal feelings about the 12 steps and our treatment system is that they need a divorce. That we should absolutely recommend that people who want to recover try the support that you can get for free 24/7 pretty much anywhere in the world from 12 steps. Absolutely worth trying. But we shouldn't be paying money to teach people that this is the one true way. And we shouldn't have rehabs that most of the content that you get is how to work the steps. I can get that at any church basement. I can't get cognitive behavioral therapy at any church basement. I can't get dialectical behavior therapy at any church basement. I can't get treatment for trauma at every church basement. And those are the things we should be paying for as taxpayers and insurers. And while, again, recommending it is great, creating treatment around it is deeply problematic. So.
Okay.
So, years ago, I saw a play about the founders of AA. And one of my biggest takeaways is that one of the operative principles of the success of AA is to be a sponsor. That's absolutely critical. That if you are actually a mentor to somebody else, that actually keeps you sober. And so it goes, pay it forward or whatever you want to say. But that seemed to be kind of critical to keeping you sober.
So I would say yes, but I would say that that's not necessarily the case for everybody. I think people need to have a sense of meaning and purpose in order to recover. And they need to feel pleasure and they need to feel that they have a life worth living. And a really good way to get meaning and purpose is to help other people. And so that is extraordinary. And I, as a person who used to be very into 12-step programs and went every day for 7 years, when I stopped doing that, I wanted to continue to pay it forward, as you said, because I feel like sharing my experience and helping other people get better is important to my own recovery. But one of the reasons I stopped going to 12 steps is that I could no longer promote it as the one true way, and that I felt like I was doing a disservice to people and I didn't want to be dishonest. So I didn't, and so, even now, like, people will email me and ask me questions about recovery, and if I possibly can, I will answer and try to support them and, help them, because I do think that's really important. And I do think that for many people, that is a great way to find meaning and purpose. But for somebody else, it might be playing the piano.
Next question.
Do you want to talk about whether a biological view of addiction, when it's empowering and when it's disempowering?
Sure. So we've historically had this idea that either addiction's a disease or it's a moral issue. And unfortunately, for the way our system ended up being presented, is that, like, the disease model became very associated with the 12 steps. So you had people going around saying addiction's a disease and the treatment is meeting, confession, and prayer. And that didn't make sense to a lot of people, so they're like, obviously that means it's really a moral issue. I do believe that addiction, there's genetic aspects to it, there's other biological aspects related to response to trauma and all of these kinds of things. I personally like to see it as a learning disorder or a developmental disorder. And what I mean by that is that in order to become addicted, you need to learn that the drug does something for you. And you need to, like, repeat that learning and reinforce that, so much so that it's like a habit of playing piano, where if you actually get good at it, you're not conscious of what you're doing anymore. And that is great if you are playing a solo and it's really working, and it's absolutely terrible if you're trying to stop yourself from doing coke and you can't. So it gets offloaded into these areas of the brain that are not very conscious and that make you have less control over your ability to say no. So I see that as a learning problem, and I think what happens there is that it's as if you fell in love with the wrong thing. So you fall in love with a substance or an activity rather than a person, and all of the things that allow us to tolerate our lovers and our children, that allow us to persist despite negative consequences, even though having a kid and having a partner and having friends is a real pain in the butt a lot of the times. That if that is directed towards a drug, your behavior is going to look really messed up. I mean, we see people in love do crazy stuff all the time. If you look at that horrible example with RFK's whatever virtual girlfriend. Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to go too far. But people do as crazy stuff for love as they do for addiction. It really looks similar. And, love is a drug. We have all these, going back to Shakespeare and beyond, analogies that, like, make this comparison, because the way your brain learns that stuff is a very deep kind of learning. And unfortunately, just like you can't choose to fall out of love with somebody, it's very difficult to choose to, like, not be addicted anymore.
Okay. Next.
Do you think that addiction in our society is growing? And can you see a correlation between mental illness and addiction? And I'm thinking specifically about the younger generation and the rate of depression and social media and electronics. I mean, even if you take public transportation these days, 90% of the people, they stare at their iPhones.
I think it's higher.
Well, okay, to be fair, they used to stare at newspapers. I do think that we are in a state of a crisis of connection. What is really interesting is that, in some sense, electronics are substituting for drugs among young people, which means you're not going to overdose on iPhone. Like, fentanyl is not going to kill you via your iPhone, thankfully. I mean, unless you go and buy some. But I think Nora Volkov of the National Institute on Drug Abuse was one of the people to point out very early on that, like, we've seen a real decline in drinking and smoking and actual drug use by this generation. We've also seen, because of the inequality and the poor state of our country and the way people are rather miserable, they are seeking other forms of escape. And I think, especially like during the pandemic, it really harmed social connection among young people, and it is very difficult to disentangle that and phones and all of the other things that are happening at the same time. I do think that you can have compulsive behavior around phones that is addictive. I absolutely do. The question is, since people are definitely not giving up their phones, how do we do harm reduction? How do we moderate this? And I think the answer is often when you find alternative reinforcers, as they call them, when you find, it's actually fun to sing with people, or, I can go talk to that person, and I can, get out of the house sometimes, and I can't, when we start, whenever a drug or an addictive behavior gets introduced to a society, there's originally a period of adjustment where people are developing social norms around what is healthy, around how to do that thing. And, part of the reason drug laws are sort of always associated with like attacks on immigrants and attacks on other sort of outsiders is because the drug gets associated with those people. And when a new thing is introduced, we don't know how to moderate. Like, it has to be learned. And I think, over time, people tend to develop that. And it's really, we gotta regulate AI. We gotta deal with the fact that if we don't do that, we are going to, because addiction and love gone awry and people are falling in love already with these AIs, if we don't do something to rein that in, it's going to be a real problem. Now, are they going to overdose? Are they going to physically get ill from that? No. But are they going to have as good a life as they could have? Also no. And we need to come up with ways that people can reconnect to each other.
So I just want to say one thing. One of my sons showed me, we all know what our iPhones look like, and they usually look like jelly beans and they're so colorful. So he showed me how to make my home screen black and white. And can I tell you something? It is not appealing. You just do not look at it and say, let me just hit ChatGPT. Let me see if I can go back. Okay, so now this is what it looks like. So much different. The difference between the black and white. And his point was that a lot of money and research has gone in to every single color on every single icon that's on your screen. It's not just a random green, or it's specifically a Tiffany blue, or it's specifically, a lot of research has gone into it to make it more attractive.
And that's an absolutely great harm reduction tip. I have seen, I don't know, it was in the Times or there was somewhere recently suggesting this as one thing to do to, free yourself of the phone. I also think keeping it on silent and not allowing those pings to get to you is really important if you can remember to turn the darn thing back on.
I have to say, I've had mine on gray for quite a while.
It's called dark mode, right?
Yeah.
No,
Yeah,
it's
and
not
I
called
don't
dark
have it.
mode.
Oh, okay.
It's under accessibility. No, it's not even that. It's under accessibility, and it is under display and text, and it's the color filters, and you turn them off.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, mine, I have an Android and it's like bedtime mode and you just put bedtime mode. But my point is I'm habituated to gray and I'm on the phone all the time anyway. Sorry.
Well, again, nothing's going to work.
Timothy?
I just want to say, you're one of the best speakers I've ever heard on this topic. Like, I'm super impressed.
Well,
I mean, you've actually walked the walk, but your opinions are really spot on. So my question, I have two questions for you. What do you think about the legalization of marijuana, A? And B, what do you think about ibogaine?
Okay, so I'll start with legalization of marijuana. Marijuana is a less harmful substance compared to alcohol and tobacco, and the only reason that it is illegal in the first place is basically racism. So I think we do need to legalize it, and we need to, as I was saying about the phones, develop norms about social use and acceptability. The way that we have cut smoking of tobacco dramatically is in a combination of like high taxes and you can't do it everywhere. When you regulate where and when things are socially acceptable, you can do a good job of reducing harms around things. And since marijuana is absolutely less harmful than alcohol or tobacco, and it often substitutes for those things and also often substitutes for opioids in terms of medical use, I think it is actually a net plus. Do I want like everybody doing dabs or something like that? No. And teenage boys are always going to do something dumb. But I think the main thing is to try to, human beings have been taking psychoactive substances since before we evolved into humans. And if you just think of cats and catnip, it is anything that has any kind of consciousness wants to alter it. We need to again, not to say that everybody should be wasted all the time. It's just more that we need to accept that teenagers are going to do risky things and minimize the harm associated with those things, and B, that people are going to seek unearned pleasure, and we need to get over it and come up with ways to minimize the harm associated with that. And as for ibogaine, I think it's quite promising.
Can you explain?
What is it?
So
I don't know.
ibogaine is a psychedelic drug that comes from somewhere in Africa, Gabon, I think, and it has the remarkable quality of you take it and you do not experience withdrawal from opioids. I actually interviewed the guy who discovered it for addiction, way back in the day, and he told me the greatest story about this. So he basically was a heroin addict at the time, and he took it, and he woke up and he had no withdrawal. And he had this absolutely crazy trip involving Freudian things about his mother. But suddenly he was like, oh, wow. I found the cure to heroin addiction. We should, promote this. And this is how we get sort of ibogaine being promoted as a therapy. And it clearly helps a lot of people. It also can potentially be dangerous to the heart. And we really need to figure out how to minimize that. And I think, it seems to be the case that places that do appropriate monitoring can help that. But the story that Howard Lotzoff, the guy the ibogaine guy, told me, I think encapsulates a lot about addiction. So when he first took it and was like, yay, I found the answer, he gave it to a bunch of his friends. And a couple of them took it, and they had their trips, and they woke up with no withdrawal. And they're like, okay, I want to go get heroin now. Because they didn't have a new meaning and purpose in their life. Nothing else, for him, this became his lifelong cause. For them, they were like, I like heroin. And they didn't have an alternative that was presented to them at the same time. And so when you, if you just use psychedelics and you don't have the ability to change the stuff around that for people, it's not a cure. It will help some people, and we need to make it safely accessible, just like the GLPs and everything else.
I would love to hear just a little bit about your journalism journey. what stories you've covered, how you like to cover them, what you're interested in now?
Sure. So when I was a teenager, before I got into drugs, I was obsessed with becoming the next Walter Cronkite, which most people here will understand. I wanted to anchor the CBS Evening News, and boy, am I glad I don't do that now. So as a kid, I was sort of torn between, do I want to do science? Because when I got to college, I got obsessed with drugs, and I was like, oh, I want to understand the brain. But then I was too squeamish to slice rats. So I decided to be a science journalist. And I have covered a lot of things. It's been really an extraordinary journey. I think a couple of the things I'm really proud of, I did a book called Help at Any Cost, How the Troubled Teen Industry Cons Parents and Hurts Kids, which is about the abusive wilderness programs. You've probably heard of Paris Hilton opposing them now. Wilderness programs, emotional growth boarding schools. Unfortunately, a lot of residential mental health care for teenagers and residential addiction care for teenagers is basically based on a cult from the 50s, where the idea was we break you to fix you. And it's been really difficult to eradicate that model, in part because people who went through it believed that it helped them, and then they found their own one somewhere else, and they pitch it as a brand new thing. And before the internet, nobody knew, they're just going from state to state, and there was this sort of media cycle where, oh, look, this guy has a new cure. And then 10 years later, oh, it's slightly abusive. And then 20 years later, oh my God, it's all abuse. And they shut down and go to a different state. So exposing some of that and getting a lot of those places closed down is something I am really proud of in terms of my work. Also, just covering, sort of understanding. I mean, when I got into recovery, or even before I got into, I sort of learned one set of myths about drugs on the street. I learned another set in rehab. And it wasn't until I started looking at the research myself and trying to really understand it and looking at it in a cross-disciplinary way that I began to actually understand it. And what's been really fun about my journalism in this area, and what anybody who's a journalist I recommend doing in this area, is just question any basic premise about addiction. Most of them are wrong. And it's really easy to get news stories by simply saying, what do we actually do in treatment centers? Or, what is this enabling thing? Or what about rock bottom? There's all these myths about what helps people get better. And so, helping break through those has been great. I am currently really happy to be writing for the kind of the Times' drugs columnist. And so that has been really fun. And I as a little kid, Maia always wanted to write for the New York Times. So, that is good. And also Scientific American. I now do not write that cocaine is addictive as potato chips. But I've been getting to do some features there that have been really fun lately. I just did something on one on children with psychopathic traits, and one on trauma and addiction treatment. And I have one forthcoming, if they ever edit it, about the predictive brain and why uncertainty is the root of all stress, which I am really proud of and hopefully gets edited too.
I want to talk about drugs and suicide. I was very interested to read that some people who didn't seem to be suicidal, who didn't have a diagnosis of depression, or they weren't expressing suicidal intent, got really drunk one day and killed themselves. And then there's the other
Can you
part of
repeat
what
the question?
people say, that addictions are slow suicides where there isn't.
Right.
I think it goes both ways.
Yeah, so the question is about addiction and suicide and the relationship, and then we will go to Lev because I know you've been raising your hand for a while. But so like anything else, it's complicated. There are certainly, amongst the overdoses, there are a lot of kind of suicides that were more of I don't care if I wake up. the vast majority of people with addiction are not suicidal, and they just, they want, this is one of the interesting things about fentanyl. Like, fentanyl is an anesthetic. It puts you to sleep. You might get 30 seconds of pleasure before you pass out. But like with heroin, like you're nodding, you're awake, like you're still there. It's like you're having analgesia, not anesthesia. People who are very unhappy, whether from depression or trauma or any of the million reasons that you might be suicidal, they want oblivion. And this is like, fentanyl will provide that. But most people who want to get high want to be there for the high. They want to feel better, not to feel nothing. And I think the sort of more suicidal or slower suicidal folks are at the point of wanting oblivion. And the other important piece of the suicide connection is that a lot of suicides are very impulsive. And addiction is often a disorder of high impulsivity. It's not always, because you can be highly compulsive like me. The impulsivity, this is why, like, if you put a barrier on bridges, it actually reduces suicides. Also why having a gun in the house is a bad idea if you have any tendencies in that direction. I couldn't, like, I don't know, I have that call of the void thing sometimes, and I am the most terrified person of death ever. But I wouldn't want anything around like that because, like, yeah, okay, so maybe I do have some impulsivity. But I do think that there is a connection, but it is a very, very complicated one that often runs through other mental illnesses and trauma as well, and impulsivity.
Just harkening back to something you said a while ago about, you were quoting a researcher who said the worst case scenario is prohibition and the second worst case scenario is commercialization. Is that right?
Yes.
I'm curious how you think that applies to gambling and like mobile sports gambling in particular, just because, we have millions of teens who are betting on Thursday night football for out of sheer boredom, I guess. And that seems to be an instance where prohibition actually did perhaps better outcomes than.
Gambling is a really interesting one because, first of all, if you look at people with like actual gambling addiction, most of them, like people with substance addictions, have trauma, mental illness, like they have all those comorbidities that tend to lead them to be the people that get stuck when other people can quit it. So it's quite interesting in that way because despite all of the that book Addiction by Design and the incredible casino stuff and all the stuff on the phone, still the majority of people don't get addicted. But gambling is, you can do a lot of damage without being addicted. And there's always been this sort of tension between what do you do about the people who are like college binge drinkers who could kill themselves accidentally in the course of that, but who, as long as they survive, they'll go on to be perfectly fine. And I think similarly with gambling, I do think that making it available on your device 24/7 is not a good idea. And that the sports betting thing is really a very difficult problem. I think we are also talk about commercialization, this is where we're at with that. And so moving away from that and putting limits on it, I think, I don't think this is a good situation with this.
Yeah. So you mentioned how one of the reasons that cigarettes are not smoked so much is that there are limits. There are also age limits. So what do you think about, I think Australia just put age limits on phones, and other countries are thinking, well, maybe we should do that.
Social media.
Social media.
Social media. Okay.
Yeah. I have, I'm of two minds of that because I remember the early days of the internet when if you were a really weird kid and nobody else around you was anything like you, and you could find good people online and find the nerds out there, and so I do, social media the way currently constructed, I don't mind banning it for kids. But internet access and access to all kinds of things, I'm not so sure about for that reason, because I do think that there are people for whom that is a real good source of social connection, and not a bad one. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens in Australia. And I mean, I think one of the things that makes drug policy so interesting and complicated is that fashion plays an enormous role in like what is available at a given time and what you are exposed. Like, for example, if like, I can't imagine this being the case for me, but if, you know, I was a kid now and sports gambling was readily available, who knows, I might have gotten into that instead of cocaine. Would that have been safer? Would that have been better? You know, but these are the things that make it really difficult and that make it more like you can't just say legalization is always the answer or prohibition is always the answer. It's going to really depend on the details of not only the specific substance, but what substitutes are available. Like when we look at the availability of something like kratom, which is a mild opioid that you can just buy in many stores now. Nobody would say it's a great idea to just introduce a mild opioid, but in the era of fentanyl, making that less available is a bad idea because it is substituting for a lot of people for pain and for, and so, you know, again, like it really depends. Like, are you going to introduce this to an opioid naive population? Then you're going to increase harm. You're introducing it to a population where something 50 times stronger than heroin is what people are having access to. Okay, now we gotta like have a different conversation about how to regulate this.
So I just want to expand on the concept of gambling, because it's not only sports gambling, it's lottery gambling, it's poly market gambling, it's Wall Street, it's day trading, it's meme stock gambling. I mean, it's become, in many ways, you know, it's armchair excitement.
Yeah, I mean, I think like it's very interesting how cultures regulate gambling over time. And I think the problem is that, you know, the core of addiction, aside from it being misplaced love, is intermittent reinforcement, which is why gambling is addictive. Because sometimes you win and sometimes you don't, and you're trying, your brain's a predictive engine, trying desperately to figure out what that pattern is. And if the pattern is random or slightly less than random, it's going to drive your brain crazy, and this is how you get addicted to gambling. I think the good news for us as a society is that a lot of people are just completely not interested in it. You know, like, again, not saying we should let it be completely unregulated, but it's one of those addictions that it's not amongst the most addictive things in general. And again, you can get specifics where you're commercially marketing something with all those pretty colors, and it gets more tricky. But I also think like the financialization and the poly market thing, and just people having jobs that are basically gambling is not really a good idea.
Okay, one more question, last question.
I'd love to,
Two more
Well,
questions.
you can do the two.
Two more, 1, 2, okay. 2 more.
I'd love to hear your take on the genetics of addiction. Where is the research going with all that?
There's a kind of rule of thumb in genetics that about like any interesting human trait is about 50% genetic. And I think this is true of addiction. And I think what's important to understand about it is that there are multiple genetic roots to addiction. So for example, somebody might have a gene that makes alcohol intolerable for them. A lot of Asian people actually have this gene that like It kind of, your face flushes and it just feels very uncomfortable, and you don't metabolize it well. And there are generally lower rates of alcohol use disorder among people who have this gene. Interestingly, when very, very, very heavy drinking became fashionable in Japan, even people with those genes were no longer protected. But that's an example of like sort of one gene you could have. But there's a million other ways you could have genes associated with addiction. Like, okay, I have autism spectrum condition and I'm like very sensory overwhelmed. This attracts me to substances because they can chill me out. That's one path, or you may be depressed. You may have a gene that, like, in the context of trauma, makes you develop depression. So it's always like iterated and complicated. And I think like one of the reasons it's so difficult to figure out the genetics of anything is that, for example, there's some interesting work in psychiatric genetics, like that show that like there seems to be one thing that increases risk for schizophrenia, depression, bipolar, and a lot of other different things. So why is it that one person gets bipolar and somebody else gets schizophrenia? It may be that, let's say, whatever this gene is biasing the brain to have a negative perspective on the world. Now, one person might interpret that as like, everybody's out to get me. Another person might interpret that as like, I suck. And so those different interpretations might over time iterate into different like conditions. And this is why the DSM is so problematic, because we don't account for the way development spirals over time, and little initial inputs can change the trajectory of a gene, whereas like you could have a gene that like gives you oversensitivity to things, which sucks to experience a lot, but also allows you to, perhaps be more creative. So I think a lot of the genetics of these things are sort of a double-edged sword, because if you take that sort of intense compulsive energy that you devoted to your addiction and now devote it to something positive, that could be a strength. Whereas if it's devoted to your addiction, it's not a strength. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, my question was, we have 343 million Americans in this country. Do you have any estimate, using your definition of addiction, what percentage are addicted today to something that, as you said, harms them?
I would just say that 10%.
Yeah.
I mean, again, like if you look at this, if you're talking phone addiction, you may be up there with 30 to 40%. But if you are, talking like alcohol, illegal drugs, gambling, when you look at the genetic study and when you just look at like, okay, what percent of people who try a substance get addicted to it? It's typically around 10 to 20%. And it'll vary with substance. It'll also vary, like, we now call addiction in the DSM substance use disorder. And it's really problematic because we used to have substance abuse and substance dependence diagnoses, both of which were absolutely terrible names. Substance abuse was basically college binge drinking with whatever particular the substance was. And the vast majority of people aged out of that. And then substance dependence is what we now call addiction, and that is the one that is, sort of more problem. But now we have substance use disorder, mild, moderate, or severe, and only moderate or severe counts as being what we traditionally consider addiction. All the mild cases are basically what we used to consider abuse. Which again, you abuse a child, not a drug. It's, it has a victim. It's a terrible name. Not that one should abuse a child. But the point is that we have doubled the rates of addictions in the last year or two, or whenever the DSM came out, by creating this spectrum diagnosis without limiting it, and nobody as a journalist can say, I'm writing about substance use disorder, moderate to severe. If you're getting paid by the word, that's great, but the editor is going to not let you do that. They're just going to say substance use disorder, and then you are creating this doubling or tripling of diagnoses without actually having that happen. And the HHS just did that, I guess trying to blame Biden.
Wow.
Okay, well, I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. I want to thank Susan and Chip Fisher for hosting us. And thank Maia for agreeing to do this.